Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining PK's webinar, Scaling Globally, Connecting Locally. Today we have Derek Phillips, our Director of Content Strategy, and Brian Payne, VP of Digital Experience Alliances, who are going to share their thoughts on creating a global content strategy. Before we get started, I want to remind everybody that all attendees have been muted, and if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature in the Zoom app. When the presentation has concluded, we'll address the questions that have been submitted, and if we do run out of time, we'll provide answers in writing and share them via email with the group. I'm going to now hand things over to Derek Phillips to get things started.
Great, thanks, Linda. So we are PK, just a little bit about us before we get into kind of the real topic here that we're here to discuss, but you should know who we are. We're a full service agency focused on delivering moments that matter to customers and to our clients. And what we really mean by that is understanding what's going to resonate with a customer to really help them make a connection with the brands that we work with and facilitate their experience with them. So we're a global organization with a suite of services and experience across several verticals, with specific depth in regulated industries like finance, healthcare, and utilities. And as we talk about what that means from a globalization and personalization, localization perspective, that expertise becomes really valuable. Today, though, we're going to talk about kind of a couple of things, both from a design perspective. And when we talk about design, we don't just mean the visual design, but also the content design, the information design, and the technical design of an experience. And we do that through integrated teams that create solutions that span those disciplines. So strategy, design, technology, and analytics and optimization. And so we're going to be focused on how we pioneer those experiences and then how we really accelerate the outcomes, which is what we're all in the business of doing. So this is where we're gonna kind of set up our two different talk tracks here that are related. And so I'm going to be focused a lot on creating and governing a global content strategy, navigating that unified and decentralized publishing models, and then delivering more relevant, personalized experiences. And Brian's going to talk about accelerating the outcomes. So Brian, you want to take that?
Yeah, so in addition to those topics that Derek summarized, we're also going to spend some time talking about how investments in technology can help you accelerate outcomes, really with a focus on understanding the role of technology. We're not going to get super technical, but we want to help you understand the role that technology can play in connecting your audiences, and how technology can help streamline language management and translation, which is a key consideration. But to be real clear, we believe really strongly that the most important point of all of this is that connection really is everything. And so if you don't believe that, you might have showed up to the wrong webinar. We're not going to talk about how you can check the box on translating your website into dozens of languages or 20, 30 different country sites. We're really here to help you understand and think about how you can build a connection with your customers and your global audience. So with that, we're going to set a little bit of context and talk a little bit about what this looked like 10 years ago. In getting prepared for today's conversation, I went back and looked at a webinar I did on this topic about 10, 12 years ago on going global. I also reviewed some work we were doing around the same time with Autodesk when we were helping them to reimagine their global content strategy. At the time, content strategy wasn't really even a defined discipline, but that's essentially what we were doing. We also worked with them to identify a content management system that would scale to support their needs. In going back 10 years, looking at kind of current state of things 10 years ago, it really highlighted for me how much things have changed in the last 10 years and really how much things have changed in the last few years. And that's where Derek and I are going to really focus. Everything we were focused on 10 years ago is still important, but today it's really foundational best practices. It's not what leaders are doing to set the bar in going globally. So 10 years ago, again, for most of the organizations we worked with, a global content strategy really just equated to a translation and localization strategy. And for the most part, clients we were working with are focused on translating their .com website into numerous different languages, different country sites. And sometimes that model was centralized, sometimes it was decentralized. But rarely, except if you were a large consumer brand where you're focused on transcreation or creating content in market. Some brands that we were working with were starting to get more sophisticated with their approach 10 years ago. They were starting to think about kind of tiering their investment by country and by market, starting to think about that but primarily from an investment perspective, now we're working with clients that think about that for strategic reasons, to understand how that their content strategy can scale better so that they can invest in the right ways to really drive a connection like I was sharing earlier. So we saw organizations starting to prioritize country sites or languages into tiers, but it wasn't really done, again, for strategic reasons. 10 years ago, we also saw organizations starting to move to a single centrally managed CMS. Like if you go back 10 years ago, that wasn't always the norm. That content management systems oftentimes were maybe kind of legacy systems that organizations were working with, or maybe even homegrown solutions. 10 years ago, we were still working with really large global clients that didn't even run their .com on an actual content management system. They had kind of ad hoc solutions that weren't well structured or well governed. And that's changed a lot. But you fast forward 10 years, and really what's driven the most change, and this change has really happened in the last probably 3 to 5 years, is consumers are more mobile, is personalization is really more top of mind. You start to see that things are more complex than ever. So instead of just thinking about taking your .com site and translating it into different languages, translating it into different country sites, really now leading brands and organizations we're working with are focused on their customers and driving a connection. Customers are engaging with your organization across more and more channels. Increasingly, again, they're mobile, social, and commerce relating channels. They're really becoming primary touch points for all of our clients. COVID has really accelerated this for many of the clients we work with at PK. Factors like personalization and localization really add to this complexity. And trying to navigate that is really especially challenging nowadays, at least to navigate it well. So in the midst of that complexity, again, the biggest thing we can't lose sight of is that the single most important point is that connection really is everything, right? It shouldn't be an effort to check the box on the number of languages that your site has been translated into, or the number of different country sites that you might have as a large global organization. This complexity I was talking about makes delivering connected experiences both increasingly challenging and increasingly important. It's why we need to invest in the content needed to support personalization and the technology that's necessary to enable it. But really, all too often, organizations that overlook the value of diversity and inclusion as part of their personalization strategy. Again, they're focused on kind of checking the box on the number of languages they translated the site into, and they're not really valuing diversity and inclusion and the role it has in connecting with their audiences. They focus more on personalizing the next best offer or selling to their customers instead of really trying to authentically connect with them. And when we look at the value in establishing a connection, there's plenty of statistics to back this up. So we just grabbed a few, but they're obvious. The importance of connecting with your audiences in their own languages is really innate. I think all of us would get this. We don't need to see stats to understand this. We put ourselves in the shoes of our customers or the audiences that we serve or want to connect with. We all understand that everybody would prefer to be engaged in their own language. We're going to be more likely to feel a connection to a brand and more likely to purchase their products if we feel like they're making an authentic effort to connect with us. And the other thing that we wanted to make sure that we didn't lose sight of is that really the importance of this for all organizations. The reality is all organizations can do a better job of valuing diversity and inclusion. Even if you're not a large global organization and you just maybe had an interest in global content strategy and you joined us today for the webinar, you don't need to be rolling this out globally to understand the importance of connecting locally and meeting your audiences and customers where they are. And your organization almost certainly should be doing this both because it values diversity and inclusion and because diversity and inclusion is valuable to your organization. You know, healthcare is a good example of this. Leading organizations are beginning to understand that localizing content really has a direct correlation to access to care, and that you really need to think about a content strategy in much the same way as you would if you were a large global organization. And this is true for a lot of industries. You know, this statistics is important that 20% of the United States population speaks a different language at home. That's something that we all shouldn't lose sight of.
Yeah, I think I'll just chime in there, Brian, is a lot of times when we start talking with clients about their translation process or approach to things, they tend to start to look outside of the US. And the reality is, like the last slide said, a lot of folks here within the United States have English as a second language. And so if we want to make real connections with the communities that we serve, then we have to understand what's the best way to make those connections. And like we saw previously, having those language options that are most comfortable for people is the first step in that process, but it's only the first step, and we're going to talk about some other steps as part of a globalization strategy today. So part of that is again having a global content strategy, and that does speak to translation, it does speak to localization, but it also speaks to what is our process and our systems that we put in place to be able to support that approach. And what we really want everyone today to walk away from this discussion with is this idea that we're moving away from the idea of distributing our content globally to instead connecting our content globally, which again, like Brian has touched on a couple of times here, is creating a deeper connection with the communities that we're trying to serve, whether that's from a marketing perspective or from a service perspective. If you're going to be a global player, you have to treat global markets seriously. And people can tell when you're doing the bare minimum, when you're just doing a straight one-to-one translation and not really considering the differences within those different markets, culturally, language, etc. And so a connected content model really brings huge efficiencies to this process. And so with that, I'll pause here because we have a quick poll to take so that we can all kind of gauge where we are. And the poll is a simple one. How would you grade your organization's global content strategy? And we've got kind of a range of options here from, yep, we've got it all figured out, we're good on this, to, yeah, we have no idea, we're just starting the process. So if you could take a moment to answer the poll, we'll share our results at the end of, or during our Q&A session at the end of our talk track here. But it'll be interesting to see kind of where everybody on this call is falling on that spectrum. So when we start our process here of defining, where are we going to begin our translation and localization and personalization process, we have to think about it in the terms of what's valuable to personalize and to translate and to localize. Content is a business asset, which means it requires investment. And so we want to understand, where is it going to be valuable both to our business, but more importantly to our customer, if we were to really personalize that experience. And so we look for a couple of things. We look at the high traffic content to understand where people are going today, but that's not necessarily the same thing as our high value content. We may have content out there that we know is important, not just to us as a business to be able to get out into the market, but is going to help customers to accomplish the tasks that they're setting out to do. But if they can't find it and it's not a high traffic area, then the value is obviously diminished. So what we want to do is understand, where is our high value content and why is it not getting the traffic it should be getting if it's not. Likewise, we want to look at where the audiences are going. So where are those high traffic areas, and analyze it so that we can learn from it and start to apply those lessons to that high value information and ensure that we're really serving those communities, because that's where we're going to invest in that deeper engagement with our content. From there, we need to establish some agreement. And this is always an interesting topic with clients when we start talking about governance. And what we have here are the quadrants from Brain Traffic. I think most people, certainly anybody in content strategy, has seen before, and it's split between the component or the content components versus the people components. And on the right, governance is a people component, because people are making decisions, which means it's inherently political. At some point, you're going to have to say no to somebody. And so if we have agreement on what our objectives are as a business, What is it our customers are trying to do? Those conversations can be a lot easier to have. They become more objective and based on what we're trying to do as a business and how we're trying to serve our audiences versus being subjective on, well, this is a project that's important to me or to my boss, or I think this is an interesting thing to do, so I'm going to push and just be the squeakiest wheel until I get what I want. And that's the other part of the equation here is governance is, because it's inherently political, and if you don't have agreement, people will find a way around your processes, around your systems. They'll find somebody within your tech group who will help them build up a microsite or a page and get it published. And so what we want to do is, again, have agreement on what we're trying to accomplish as a group that will then help us to determine what our processes and protocols are from a governance perspective. With that, we have to assemble a team. This is a great graphic that I just came across. We work with Gather Content quite a bit as a pre-CMS tool among some other tools like Sitecore's Content Hub. But the Gather Content pyramid here, I think, is really interesting because it very simply lays out the different roles that you need within your team. So you have to have that strategic authority, somebody who understands what you're trying to do as a business, who can speak to the organization's objectives and where you're going, not just what you're doing today or what you're focused on. From there, though, we have to have some accountability in how that gets implemented. We have to have people who are keeping the lights on, who are running things from a day-to-day perspective on an operational side. And then the last piece are the specialists. These are the folks that we all know within an organization who can speak to what our services or our products are really best at accomplishing. And so they'll bring some skills or insights that really strengthen that content and really help you to create relevant content in support of your strategic objectives. So some things that we want to think about are who can represent the brand, who can speak to our business objectives or our priorities, who can be our editorial expert or run things from an operational perspective. And the last piece, but certainly not the least important piece, is legal and compliance, especially in regulated industries. If we can bring our legal and compliance partners into this process and into this conversation, we can gain a lot of efficiencies because they're not having to come to us later and say, yeah, you can't really say it that way because of X, Y, and Z. So now we need to start thinking about what our publishing models look like. If we have our team in place and we have our governance process in place, how are we going to start to create a system where we're getting content to the right places and within the right markets in consideration of those local or regional objectives as well? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time here talking about what that really looks like. And on the next slide here, we start to talk about something that Brian touched on earlier in understanding these kind of tiers of investment that we're going to make. And again, maybe 10 years ago, there used to be really one perspective on how we would define those tiers. And it was all from a business perspective or where we saw emerging markets, right? And now we see a lot more sophistication from the leaders in the market. Again, if translation and localization are deeper investments in our content, we want to really understand where to make those investments. Likewise, we have more opportunities now to transcreate or to have our local teams in regions create the content with us as partners because they know the market the best. They know the culture the best and can speak the language and understand the unique opportunities and restrictions maybe that are within those different markets. We work with a healthcare manufacturer where the complexities around what you can and can't say about a product get pretty complicated pretty quickly. And so we really rely on working with our local partners, the people who are in region, to help us really navigate that. If we can start to move some of that creation of content out of a centralized system and into a process that allows them to create that content, we're naturally going to have some efficiencies as a part of that process. It all starts with, though, understanding what we're trying to do, what our objectives are. And so what we do the role of any content strategist is to really understand the business and how the content can support it. So we have a number of kind of key stakeholder questions that we have, but some of these are specifically focused on what we need the content to do. And I'll quickly go through these, but we want to describe the primary business or customer of your business group. Why? Because again, we're trying to make a better connection with actual people and customers. So the better we can understand who that customer is, the more relevant we can make that experience. We want to understand the types of content they need to be able to create within their market. What are the formats or the different content interaction models that are going to help them to achieve their business goals? What are the significant challenges or roadblocks that they run into? Again, like I said, sometimes there are regulatory issues that are specific to a market. The sooner we know that, the better we can accommodate it from a content perspective. There are tools that we need to account for. And then there are business critical initiatives that, yes, are in support of our overall business objectives, but may be unique to that market. All of which is going to help us to figure out what is the type of content that we need to translate and localize in support of all of these objectives. So from there, we want to really create these more relevant, personalized experiences, right? This is the whole point, again. And so if we get to the next slide here, to kind of really focus on what I mean by content being an investment or a deeper investment as we personalize and localize our experience, this is what it looks like, right? So the more focused the experience is on a particular type of customer in a particular local community, the more content we're going to need to be able to support that experience. In a kind of a rough way to think about that is if we had 4 verticals and 3 roles that we were focused on, so 3 types of customers that we were focused on, well, now we need 12 personalized components plus a baseline, right? We always have that baseline for most of us on this call. It's probably your US English version of content, but then you're going to want to personalize and translate that content. That means you have to have 13 different variations of those content objects that you're targeting. So you can see how this math can add up really quickly, right? We can if we're going to target 10 components within a page, for example, we have to have 130 different variations of those components to be able to meet our personalization objective. So again, this is why it's important to really understand where the value is on personalization and localization of content, because the investment can add up quickly. And it doesn't mean that we don't want to make that investment. We absolutely do, where it makes sense and where we're going to get a great return, not just for our business, but for our customer. That means we need to think about the operations side of things, because again, now we're talking about really revving up our content engine. And so we have to have a solid operational perspective behind us. And if we look again at the next slide here, we're going to talk about our teams. So we had, the gather content example here, where we had our strategic authority, we had our implementation accountability, those are authors and editors, and then we have specialists who are providing input on the products and services. If we really want to take our local markets seriously and really treat them as a real business priority, our recommendation is to look at how we can start to bring resources in market to be those implementation partners and those specialists, because again, they will understand the details and the complexity of their local market better than anybody else. And so there won't be a lot of conversation back and forth of what you can and can't do. They will know what you can and can't do and be able to come up with content solutions that fit within those parameters in support of business objectives. Brian will talk about what that looks like and how that gets supported from a system side of things in just a minute here. But really the key takeaway here again is to really rethink about your content operations. And it's not a matter of creating content centrally and then distributing it out to your local markets. It's about having more trans-creation partnerships within those local markets in support of your larger objectives, which again goes back to having agreement so that we have a very clear governance process and structure in place. So let's talk about the role of technology. Brian, chime in, please.
Yeah. Thanks, Derek. So speaking of technology, I kind of led off with what current state looked like 10 years ago. And again, to kind of recap, 10 years ago, we were focused on content publishing as a function of the content management system or CMS that you might be working with. That was the primary focus on going global for most large organizations we were working with. That's still important. In fact, having a well-architected, well-implemented, single centrally managed CMS has gone from a nice to have like it was 10 years ago to really a must have. In the importance of it being well implemented, well architected, it is key. We're not going to get into the technical specifics of this, but you really need to, whether you're going about this with in-house team members or you're working with a partner, you need to ensure that you're working with folks that really understand what this looks like. It's one thing to implement a content management system that supports one website, but it's yet something entirely different when it needs to scale to maybe support dozens of languages in 20, 30, 40 different country sites. Understanding the importance of content, how content should be structured, how the implementation of languages should be architected, as well as the architecture for sites, is really key. Everything that you do slightly wrong as part of the architecture and implementation of the CMS is going to be amplified as part of scaling it out globally. And then you need to plan for expansion. Things are going to change. Over like last 10 years or so, we've worked with some clients that have dramatically rethought their global content strategy as their organizational needs and goals and business objectives have evolved. Like Derek was talking about a unified, decentralized model. We've worked with clients that had completely decentralized models, went to a really unified model and strong governance model, and then back to something that looked like a hybrid model. We've worked with some clients that have been able to do all of that without needing to re-platform or re-implement their CMS, and we've worked with other clients that that needed to do so. So understanding what you need to have there is really a key must-have. But the biggest area that we've seen change, in particular the last few years, is coming back to what Derek was sharing around content operations. We've increasingly see clients investing in what we would refer to as a CMP or a content marketing platform. So a content marketing platform isn't really even a well-defined product or tool today. It's really an evolving kind of mix of solutions. Content marketing platform sits upstream of your CMS. Derek sort of alluded to this when he mentioned gather content and showed the slide related to that earlier. What a content marketing platform does essentially is it helps you manage the overall content production lifecycle. This can be done through, for some organizations, just buying a product that meets their needs, like a single tool. There's vendors that provide them. Or for larger organizations, oftentimes you have to assemble essentially a content marketing platform through a combination of different tools from different vendors that address some of the key areas. What you really need to focus on if you're going to support content operations at scale, like Derek was describing, is making sure you're using a unified tool set to manage content planning and scheduling, content creation and collaboration. And again, this needs to not happen in channel. That's where most organizations do this kind of work today. So when you go into an organization, and this might be the case at the organization you work with, oftentimes you'll see content planning and scheduling is used. Maybe there's different project management tools being used. Maybe that's all done in spreadsheets or just ad hoc. And then you get into content creation and collaboration. Maybe that's done in shared documents or collaboration systems outside of the CMS, but then you get into the final review and approval and workflow. It happens in the CMS. It happens in each individual channel. If you can move that effort upstream, everything can be better organized, it can be better run, and it can be streamlined. You can also manage that entire process much better. So as an example, you look at aggregating product content. If you are pulling in product information from source systems and you're having to support that across different channels. If you're not using a CMP, likely you're doing a lot of repetitive work around an area such as that. You also likely aren't pulling in content analytics and insights back to a solution that your authors and your content creators can actually see. So they probably don't have a view into channel specific analytics. So if they're producing content for you, they don't really even have a view to understand what engagement around that content looks like. And you end up with ultimately like a really siloed solution if you haven't invested in a CMP. So in relation to that, probably the most important topic to think about when you're trying to understand the role of technology in all of this is understanding how technology can better streamline language management and translation. So there's some basics around this, some basic concepts you really need to understand if you're charged with kind of leading this effort or supporting this effort. A key building block is how you automate translation workflow. Almost never should you have the folks that are doing translation for you in your content management system doing translation. Almost always you would have those folks, either whether they're external translators working with you through a translation service provider or internal resources, or in some cases if you're using machine translation, that's all going to typically happen outside of that system that's responsible for publishing content. So if you look at a CMS, there's what I would refer to as translation connectors available. Most well-adopted CMS platforms have a range that are available for them. And the key role that these translation connectors play in automating workflow, they allow you to author the source content, say in English US language, publish that source content, automatically export it for translation. Translation happens outside of that publishing tool that you're using, and then can be automatically re-imported and automatically published. So essentially, when set up and configured, that function of translation, again, this doesn't solve all of the solutions that Derek was describing earlier, but the function of just translating content can be automated, can be streamlined. Why that's so important is because if you don't take steps to automate and streamline the translation of content that you're just going to translate, your team is going to be so caught up in all the effort that they have to spend with that they're not going to be able to focus on the high value content that Derek was talking to earlier. The content that you're localizing, you're really taking steps to adapt for local markets or are transcreating and creating in market. And again, similar to what I was sharing about a CMP earlier and the value they provide as compared to just managing this all from a publishing perspective in your CMS platform, is similar when you move translation upstream. So the key point here is that CMP I was describing really provides a function of publishing content across channels. You may have invested in a CMS and you may be using your CMS to publish content across a couple of channels, but you almost certainly are not using your CMS if you have a single centrally managed CMS, even if it's really well architected, to publish across all of your marketing channels. And like we were talking about earlier, the complexity is real when you're trying to do this at a global scale. If you move translation upstream to your CMP, you see real economies of scale. You reduce cycle time significantly. When you're automating translation at the channel level, like at the CMS level, you're going to see some improvements, but not the types of improvements in cycle times that you see when you implement this at the CMP level. It also really increases visibility across all of your teams. As Derek was describing where and how to assemble teams, this is really important. Implementing a CMP, moving translation upstream, so you're integrating and automating at the translation workflow at the CMP level, provides visibility across all of your stakeholders that are involved. So that can be your core team that is say responsible for managing your .com, and then all of your subject matter experts that are in market and supporting those efforts. And it really will improve orchestration because you can better understand everything that is, for instance, the moving parts associated with going to market with a campaign that might launch on your .com, maybe globally in certain select markets. In the orchestration behind all of that can be really challenging. Moving translation upstream reduces that. It also really has a cost savings, and it can really reduce your translation spend. You're more efficient with the content that you're translating when you move that upstream. And to kind of highlight why you become more efficient, it really at the core of that is how you as an organization are using translation memory. If you've never been involved in like the actual translation or localization process as part of your organization, you might not even be familiar with what translation memory actually is. But it's a key consideration. Essentially, what a translation memory system will do is stores your source text and translations as segments, and it recognizes repetition as translators work. So translators will work in a tool that is using translation memory to streamline their translation tasks. It can almost be similar to like the way like auto suggest might work in some tools now that provide that as part of like kind of auto completing emails or auto completing sentences in a document. And it really can speed up the translation process. And again, the more you streamline and do this, it's not about automating the process just for the sake of automating it. It's automating and streamlining the process so that where you spend your time is on the most important parts in all of these steps, right? So you're focused on, again, the high value content. You're focused on the content where you really can drive a connection, and you're really spending your time and resources there, thinking very empathetically about how that content should best be localized and can best be localized. And to highlight an example of like where we've seen translation memory work in practice at scale, when it works, and it works, usually it works well most of the time, and it's kind of incremental value. But at times when really implemented well and really leveraged to its full extent, like I would almost describe it as a bit like magic. We had one client recently that we worked with that needed to expedite the launch of a global site. They had descriptions for 2 million plus product SKUs that needed to be translated. That just the sheer effort associated with translating that volume of content was significant, and it was really kind of critical path on launching the site. In a typical process, that would have happened after the CMS platform had been implemented, the new site had been designed, the source content had been written, reviewed, and approved. Everything would go out for translation. That would have pushed their timeline out 3 to 4 months or more, and that included really staffing up with a significant size team running the translation effort itself. What we did in that case to pull in the timeline was we ran everything through translation memory in the translation process. There was still work that needed to be done in the final review and approval of that content before it actually got published. That happened in parallel to the first pass at translation. And then when we had content that was final and had been reviewed and approved, site was ready to go live, we ran it back through translation memory, and we saw almost a 95% match, like an exact match. A translator didn't need to look at the content at all. There was about 1% of the content the translator needed to go back in, actually retranslate the content. And about 4% of the content is kind of what I would refer to as a fuzzy match. Like they had to look at it, they had to maybe just confirm that the translation that was suggested was actually correct. That's kind of the extreme end of like how translation memory can scale, but it provides real value. And most organizations don't even know where translation memory sits. You might not even own your translation memory. If you work with a third-party vendor that does translation for you, they might actually own that translation memory. And it's a valuable tool that really shouldn't be overlooked. Another consideration that we get asked a lot about is machine translation. You see this sometimes on sites. You'll see that, like for instance, we were talking to a healthcare client recently, and they were using Google Translate to translate their site. It was a really large site. It probably didn't seem approachable to translate all of the site into all the languages that they wanted to support. So they slapped ability to use Google Translate. Debatable whether that's a valuable service. I think most folks understand how to use Google Translate themselves or similar tools if they're not a native English speaker in this case. But there's a real risk associated with using machine translation. You really should closely review if you're considering using this or using this today, whether it is the right fit for your organization. And the risk really, it can be pretty obvious. If you go out and Google translation fails, you'll see the risk associated with using machine translation. It's improved a lot, but the biggest gap in machine translation today is context. Machine translation doesn't really understand context, regardless of the solutions. And there's a lot in the market. It's not just Google Translate. There's many other cloud providers that provide really improved machine translation capabilities, but they're never going to meet the capabilities that an actual human can drive with translation. They're going to always miss the human component of context as part of their translation. That's not to say that you shouldn't use them. And there's some really clear use cases where you should consider them. So these examples that I've pulled here are, I think, one from bookings.com and one from another travel site where they're using machine translation to translate user-generated content. That can be a really good use of machine translation. So if you have a commerce site and reviews are really key to conversion and to inspiring confidence in your customers, you might consider using machine translation to translate reviews of your products. That's a really common use case. Machine translation obviously is lower cost than using human translation, and more importantly, you can provide near real-time translation through using machine translation. So it can be a really good use for user-generated content, but again, you need to be very careful about how you're using it. You really need to be careful that you're not misrepresenting content or that the context of that content hasn't shifted as part of using machine translation. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Derek to talk a little bit about like next steps. Like, where do you start with all of this?
Right. So some key takeaways here are captured here, but we start with write less and say more, right? Again, translation is a cost. And so we want to be able to understand how we can really connect with our customers without adding to that translation cost. And largely it is about context, like Brian was saying, and understanding where our customers are in their journey, what it is they need to accomplish next, and then being as concise and efficient in our language to help support that. We also want to engage our regional stakeholders. Like I mentioned before, they understand the business in their area better than anybody else. And so really engaging them and partnering with those regional stakeholders is a crucial piece to be able to treat those outside of the US markets more seriously. We want to inventory our content. So once we understand what our stakeholders are trying to accomplish, let's look at what we have out there. A lot of times what we find when we're starting a globalization project is clients have largely just kind of translated what they had for the US and transmitted it out to the local markets. And they might be communicating pieces that aren't even relevant to that market, or they might be missing opportunities to communicate particular pieces of their business. So we want to inventory our content and understand where the gaps are, where the opportunities are. We want to make sense of our analytics. So again, that's how we start to identify our high value and high traffic content. We have to understand whether we have a clear view of what's performing and what's not performing well for us. And that starts with our analytics approach and our tagging structure and strategies. We want to complete a competitive audit. Who's out there that you compete with that's doing it really well, or that has created some gaps in the market that you can take advantage of? We won't know that if we don't take a look at our competitors. And sometimes we want to look outside of our direct competitors or industry competitors and look at who's doing the type of content delivery that we would like to be doing, and we can learn from them. You know, for years we heard businesses need to think like publishers. Well, let's look at what publishers are doing and how they are reaching out to audiences globally. And then we want to put together a roadmap because we have to understand where we're going to make our future investments from a technology perspective, from a resourcing perspective, and from an experience perspective. But that requires some planning, and we want to have a roadmap in place that we can make the right decisions in support of technology and process that will help us to get down the road. We don't want to make those decisions in a silo or with blinders on. And then the last piece should be obvious to everybody, but we have to value diversity and inclusion, and that can't be a talking point. I think we see around the world right now how important this is, and how the stakes are higher and the expectations are higher, and they're rightly higher. So we want to really show what we mean when we say that we value diversity and inclusion by having real outreach to all of our customers and to all of the markets where they live and where we can meet them. So value and diversity and inclusion is not a tagline. It is a real value, not just a valuable thing to do, but how we kind of think about ourselves and what we find important. So
and
we have,
yeah, go ahead. Sorry, Derek. I was going to say, hopefully it's come through for everybody that Derek and I love to talk about this topic and have been doing so for quite a while. We would really, welcome the chance to meet with anybody that's on the call today, help you kind of think about what a multi-year roadmap might look like, help you understand how you can help your organization better value diversity and inclusion as part of all this. Like Derek was talking about, like making sense of your analytics as an example. That's a really good, important step. But if you aren't doing a good job with this today, your analytics aren't going to reflect the value in investing this it will provide for your organization. Likewise, if you're not doing a good job with this today, or you need to kind of rethink where you're investing, developing a multi-year roadmap and just figuring out where you get started there can be really challenging. So we're going to follow up after the webinar. If you're interested in just catching some time, Derek and I would love to extend the offer to catch up with you and talk about some of these topics that we've shared today in lessons learned from working with other clients over the years. So with that, should we share the poll results, Derek?
Yeah. I want to see where everybody kind of landed.
So
again, the question was, how would you grade your organization's global content strategy?
Mm-hmm. And it looks like, for the most part, most people are like, "Nah, we'll figure it out." There's a couple people that are pretty good. There's literally one person that's doing great, and we have it all figured out. Hopefully, that's somebody that works for us at PK.
That's right.
Linda, do we have some questions from folks that maybe we can kind of field? And if not, we can talk a little bit about that poll result.
Yes, we did get a few questions, and I will start with the first one. We translate our website into a handful of languages. We're growing globally. Should we start adding country-specific sites?
Derek, you want me to take that one?
You take you start it, and I'll chime in as necessary.
So I have a pretty strong opinion about this. What I've seen organizations do, and where I see them misstep, is they try to do it halfway. So you'll oftentimes see organizations roll out like regional sites or just a few country sites. That can be appropriate depending on your organization. If you really distinctly have an in-country presence in just a few countries, it might make sense to have just a few country sites. What you really should avoid, though, is adopting a strategy that you can't sustain. And usually you see that being reflected as organizations adopting regional sites, maybe a bunch of country-specific sites for, say, Europe, but just grouping all of Asia under a regional Asia site. That's completely inappropriate. You'd be better off just having language-specific translations of your .com site than trying to do it halfway.
Yeah, I would add to that from a strategic standpoint. We have some countries where there are multiple languages being spoken. Canada is the most obvious, our neighbors to the north, where English and French are spoken. And so it's a matter of really, again, going back to what's going to best serve your customer needs in the areas that you see opportunity for your business. And so if we think about Canada, right, we wouldn't have a Canadian country site. We would have English and French to be able to serve our Canadian customers.
Okay, thanks. The next question is a two-parter. How do you identify content that should be personalized? And don't you want to try and personalize everything?
That is often where these conversations start. And a lot of times we get very excited about the capabilities from a technology perspective. So yes, we can technically personalize whatever we want. The real challenge becomes having the content to support it. So I go back to that math that I had shared earlier. We have to have multiple variations of every piece of content that we're going to translate. So it adds up really quickly. The system can handle that. We might not have the content to fuel that system though, and that becomes a big task. So what we want to again focus on are understanding our customers, and there are 4 things I think about with a customer, but we'll focus on 2. What is their mindset? So what are they trying to accomplish, and what are some roadblocks that they might encounter as a part of that? When we have that conversation with clients and we're looking at a particular touch point, and I say, look, we see that a lot of customers are struggling to get to the next step because they don't know what they're supposed to do. Most of the time, the client will say, well, we have information to help them with that. Great, that's what we need to be able to surface. And in this case, that's probably an indicator of some content that we should translate as well. So we want to make sure that everyone who's trying to get over that roadblock has the information delivered to them in the most relevant way that will help them get to that next step. There is a whole process that we go through in helping to identify where we want to make these content investments, but those are some examples of how we start to approach that question or that challenge.
Okay, thanks, Derek. Next question. We're a healthcare organization in the US. We have a huge website and really don't translate any of it. Where do we start?
So you want me to take that one, Derek?
Yeah, why don't you go back, because I think the answer I just gave a second ago speaks to a lot of the strategic thinking, but why don't you take it from there?
You know, we work a lot in healthcare, and we work with organizations in healthcare that have sites that could be upwards of 30,000 plus pages of content. It can be a really daunting task to really figure out what the right translation or localization strategy should be if you're in that position, especially if you're starting from zero. You started to see leaders like Mayo translate a large percentage, if not all of their content, and understanding the value in doing that. But most organizations don't have those types of resources. I think what you might consider is something similar to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like maybe tiering content sites across countries, but rather thinking about how you might tier your own site as a healthcare provider, say in the United States. What we often see folks doing right now is that if they're not translating any of their site, they might publish, like, say, PDFs of translated content that cover kind of regulatory and compliance considerations, or just kind of the bare minimum. A better strategy might be to think about how essentially you could build out kind of tiered sites that are specifically written, targeted at those specific languages. So rather than thinking about translating 30,000 pages, or just like 1 or 2 key landing pages, or publishing a handful of translated PDFs that folks are supposed to expected to find through the footer of your website, a better strategy might be to have smaller sites that are targeted specifically at the languages that you should be supporting.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, again, if we think back to how we identify our valuable content, we think about it again from the patient's perspective. What is it they need? So an easy one to identify is location information, and emergency room information, or emergency support information, but also translating information that helps them to select a provider that's going to be right for them. In the healthcare index that our colleague Dave Winnicky drafted, and that Brian and I refer to a lot when we're talking to our healthcare clients, he's identified lots of opportunities of where we should be investing that deeper connection to our patients in the content that we create for them, but also in where we might want to personalize or or translate that copy or that content for them. So again, thinking about what's going to really help that patient to navigate their healthcare experience is important. Again, emergency information is a no-brainer, but also there are other tasks that are common to all patients that just need maybe a different approach to be able to meet their language or cultural needs.
Okay, thanks. We got a couple of minutes left. The next question is, are there other instances where you would recommend machine translation?
I would really focus on user-generated content. So in the example I highlighted, I shared reviews. That's a starting point because reviews play such an important role in customer engagement and building trust with your audiences. Even doing it there, though, I would be careful about how you did it. It was subtle. I didn't call it out in that example I shared, but Booking.com and the other site I grabbed an excerpt of reviews from. They're using a couple of different models. One of them automatically uses machine translation to translate the content. You're not really overtly aware. There's kind of a footnote or kind of a small mention that you would easily overlook that it was machine translated. The other one provides a link to, I think, Google Translate in the example I gave. That, so it shows it in the original language that user-generated content, in this case a review, was written in, and then gives the user the ability to quickly translate that into their local language. I think you need to really kind of understand that. You need to understand how you, as your organization, your brand, should be connecting with your customers and where that role would fit. But I would almost certainly not see it moving outside of user-generated content.
Okay, and we have one more question. I think we have enough time to cover it. What are some ways to identify your high traffic, high value content?
Yeah, so again, it goes back to analytics. And we want to understand, the high traffic is probably easy to figure out where what pages are getting the most traffic and the longest engagement times. Looking at where people are going next from those pages can tell us a lot about how they consumed the content on that page. From understanding the high value content, though, goes back to the stakeholders, our business stakeholders, and understanding, again, what is it we're trying to do from a business objective, and what information do we have to support that? A lot of times, again, like I mentioned earlier, our most valuable information is not our highest trafficked information. And so we want to understand how we can get that valuable information in front of more people at the right point in their journey, and understanding how people are navigating throughout your experience is a part of that. So what we look at are again, our traffic numbers and our analytics, but also understanding our business objectives and the types of information we have in support of those objectives, and then looking for opportunities to reuse it. A lot of times, and we find this a lot when we're working with product sites, the best information is locked within a product brochure. Well, let's take it out of that product brochure and surface it on the product details page so that we can really get that valuable information in front of the customer sooner.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, Derek and Brian. We have no more questions that have been submitted. I would like to thank everyone for your time today and hope that you found value in the presentation. As a reminder, you will get an email with a link to the webinar recording and also how to connect with one of today's presenters if you'd like to discuss how you can get started building your multi-year roadmap. Have a great rest of your day and stay safe.
Thank you.